So like discussed in the previous chapter, we can create our own functions, or Python already has defined a number of functions that will do regular jobs that most programmers need. For example, calculation of interest is something that's very specific to the banking and financial sector. So Python is not going to have anything for that because it's a very specific requirement. But to calculate the length of a string is something that every programmer is going to use at some point in time. So Python is going to have predefined functions that can calculate the length of a string. So there are user-defined functions and then Python standard functions. We're going to first look at user-defined functions, meaning how to create your own function. Once you understand that, we can look at some of the Python standard functions. You don't have to go through an exhaustive list. Just we'll go through a couple of them to understand how to look for your own functions or how to use Python's standard functions. So let's start off with user-defined functions. User-defined functions. So what's a user-defined function? So here is an example. The same example that we have been talking about. How to calculate the interest on a bank account. Now, what are the parameters that are required to calculate the interest on an account? So to calculate the interest on a bank account, at least we need three things. What's the balance in the account? Say there's a balance of $1,000. What's the interest rate? Say the interest rate is 4% for savings account. And what is the number of days you need to calculate the interest for? Do we need to calculate it since the beginning of the year, since the beginning of the quarter? Let's say beginning of the year. Say beginning of the year, since January 1st. So the number of days, say 30 days or 40 days. And what's the output? The output is the interest amount. The way Python defines it is like this. To define a function, you start with def for define. Define, this is the name of the function. For example, to calculate the length of a string, the name of the function was len. len. That was a simple name. But most of the time, Python functions, user-defined functions specifically, have a very descriptive name, like calculate underscore interest. And then these are called input parameters. Think of them like instructions. Even an automated machine requires instructions. So think of them like instructions. And there's this calculation. So there's some logic. We'll come to that. And finally, there is a return statement which returns the interest amount. Now sometimes there is no return statement because the function might not return something. In which case, this statement is not relevant. But most of the time, functions do stuff and then return you a value. So that's what is being shown here. These are the input parameters. This is the actual function, the one in yellow. And then finally, what's calculated is returned by the function. And the way to call it is something that we actually know already, right? So to calculate the length of a string, you say len of the string. And then this function returns something and you put that in a variable, right? Or you print it out, either way. Similarly, this function that we have defined just now takes these input parameters, the account balance, the interest rate and the number of days, and it returns the interest amount. Now you can do what you want with that amount. You can print it, you can use it for doing another calculation, so on and so forth. Now let's actually create this function in Python and see how it works. Alright, what do we want to define? We want to define a function that says def to define the function. Calculate interest, that's the name of the function. Then we have three parameters, right? What are the three parameters? Balance, interest, days. And as usual, we start with a colon, indent, and then there's this formula, right? Interest amount equals balance into interest by 100, whatever the logic there is. I'll just copy that piece of string and then put it here. And finally, we're going to return the interest amount, right? So let's execute this. Okay, now can we calculate interest? Let's say calculate interest on a balance of $1,000 or 1,000 rupees with an interest of 4% and for 100 days. Let's execute this. So that's $10.95 for 100 days. So that is how you create functions and use them.